Welcome back. We are discussing a new topic today, and the topic is hope. I know I'd mentioned in my previous video that we'll be taking up the topic with regard to the 7 deadly sins, but I figured that it would be best to talk about the virtues before we proceed to the vices. And what better virtue than hope? The world as we have known it has changed over the past 1 year, and the change has been dramatic. COVID-19 has pushed us out of our comfort zone. The lockdowns world over has pulled the plug on our freedom, whether it be the freedom of movement, the freedom to congregate and socialize, the freedom of worship, of expression, and even of choice. Naturally, this has had consequences. It is said that mental health issues are rampant across all age groups. And this is not difficult to understand, given that we've been asked to act against our very nature as social beings. We've had to reconcile to living a life of isolation. The resultant fallout has been fear, anxiety, and depression on account of the uncertainty. But above all, people have felt a sense of despair arising from the question if life is ever going to return to a state of normalcy. And despair is the opposite of hope. So what is hope? Hope, just as in the case of love, may be said to have a natural and a supernatural dimension. In order to understand hope, or rather the lack of it from a natural perspective, let's revert to the discussion on the pandemic. It is true that the world has slowly limped back to normalcy externally, but it is far from true that people are living a peaceful existence internally. But why? This is because most people are in a tumultuous state on account of the fact that, on the one hand, vaccines are being touted as the solution to the problem, and on the other hand, there is a certain section of society that feels a certain sense of apprehension on account of not knowing what is being injected into their bodies. Life is a fundamental good, and all of us have a moral duty of preserving health and life by way of medical treatments. However, there are 2 conditions to be met. Firstly, that the medical treatment offers a reasonable hope for beneficial results. And secondly, that the treatment should not place an impossible burden, either physically or morally. Coming to the first condition, which is reasonable hope for beneficial results. It is incumbent upon each of us to dig deeper and check the veracity of the information of scientific research, whether it be the efficacy of the vaccines, that is, to achieve immunity to the virus or to stop transmission of the virus, to check with regard to the possible side effects, to know more about the different kinds of vaccines, and so on and so forth. With regard to the second condition, that is, that the treatment should not place an impossible burden, either physically or morally, the physical burden in this case could be considered the cost of the vaccine. And we're told that it's going to be negligible and perhaps in some situations may even be provided free of cost. What about the moral burden? Morality implies freedom of choice, that is to say, yes or no. In other words, freedom means the power to act or not to act, to do this or that, to perform a deliberate action on one's own responsibility. That said, it is true, and that there is no doubt that sometimes individual freedom ought to be sacrificed for the sake of the common good. In this case, the common good is the prevention of possible death with regard to many. Again, research with regard to the mortality rate recovery rate, and so on, will help us to come to a rational conclusion with regard to the common good and the freedom that we're called to give up. So, given the bleak scenario, the uncertainty, what are we called to do? How are we to have hope? A very practical solution would be that we are not called to be anxious about the future, knowing that everything that happens on account of the will of God, on account of His providence. So this is the natural dimension of hope. What about the supernatural dimension? Hope, just as in the case of agape, is a gift of God. God infuses hope into the human person by way of His grace. God desires our happiness and seeks what is best for us. But the good that He desires above all is our union with Him in this life and in the life to come. So this is why hope is said to have a transcendent dimension. So if hope is merely a gift of God, the question arises if man has a role to play. And the answer lies in the fact that hope is also acquired. In other words, man has a role to play by way of his own efforts in order to grow in the habit. This is why virtue is called a habit, because it is perfected by and through repetitive action. Virtue is also said to lie in the middle, in the sense that it does not tend to extremes. So let's illustrate the supernatural dimension of hope by way of an example. Take the case of a man who's led a life of debauchery or licentiousness or immorality. Suddenly, on account of the intervention of God through grace, he repents of his misdeeds and begins to have trust in the mercy and help of God in order to attain union with Him in this life and in the life to come. This is the supernatural dimension of hope as a gift. How about hope as an acquired virtue? Take the same example. While such a man may have experienced the mercy of God and may have repented for his sins, he may still have doubt with regard to God's forgiveness towards him and may still suffer on account of the guilt because of his wrongdoings. It is then that he is called to practice hope. That is, repeated acts of trust in the love and mercy of God. How about the fact that virtue lies in the middle? Such a man who's turned his life around will not tend to either extreme. This simply means that he will not neglect his family and duties in order to pursue God, nor will he give up on practices in order to grow in hope. This is why those who say that X, Y, or Z is too virtuous have not understood the meaning of virtue, because virtue lies in the middle. So, having understood the natural and the supernatural dimensions of hope, I thought it would be best to bring this all together by way of a book, one of my all-time favorites, Tuesdays with Maury by Mitch Albom. I'm certain most of you have read the book. It's a New York Times bestseller. But for those of you who haven't had a chance to read the book, the story centers around a professor, Professor Maury, who's been detected with ALS, a degenerative neuromuscular disease, which eventually leads to loss of control and atrophy of the muscles. The book is essentially a series of conversations spanning 14 weeks between Professor Maury and the author, Mitch Albom, a successful, ambitious sports journalist. Through these conversations, Professor Mori teaches the author about the importance of love, forgiveness, acceptance of others, of pursuing what one is passionate about rather than just chasing after money. But what transforms the author, most importantly, is his dying professor's attitude towards death. And I quote Professor Mori. He says, "Society does not encourage people to think about death. People are in denial that they will die someday." And he goes on to say that if people learn to die, then they will learn to live. And people will live very differently if they knew that they would die or could die at any moment. Here is a man with hope in the face of impending death. Here is a man who's not anxious about the future. Here is a man who has come to understand that death is not the final word and who has had certainty with regard to the life to come. What a lesson. Because this is not fiction, this is a real life story. It is true that we live in an age of diminished hope. And the problem is not on account of the fact that we hope for too much, but that we have come to settle for so little. It is that we're so focused on things around us, on what is happening in the natural. That is why hope is eroded when we see the deaths or what is being shown in the media by way of hospitalizations, etc., etc. This is when hope erodes. It is on account of the fact that we have lost sight of who we are and where we are going. Who are we? We are pilgrims, wayfarers, making our way to God and the life to come. This ought to give us hope. And finally, as G.K. Chesterton says, hope means to hope when everything seems hopeless, or it is no virtue at all. I hope you enjoyed.